This is Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark MacDonald. Gambling, advertising, politics, and household chores. What do these have to do with each other? They're all areas where your brain can steer you wrong when making decisions, as we'll see in today's episode. We're going to be talking about one of the most influential ideas in the science of judgment and decision-making, called dual process theory. This model is explained clearly in the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman. The book talks about psychological research on how our intuition and reasoning work, and explains where our brains tend to make mistakes and how to correct those errors. In this episode, I'm talking about the science of judgment and decision-making, drawing heavily from Thinking Fast and Slow as a major source. So, let's get started. The title of the book, Thinking Fast and Slow, refers to the fact that you have two little people in your brain who do all your thinking. Well, for a given value of the word person, Kahneman once called them intuition and reasoning. I think of them as a robot and a detective. The robot is your intuition. It gives the fast, efficient, automatic responses to things that all animals need to survive. The detective is your reasoning. It does the logical, methodical, and thorough thinking. Psychologists tend to call these characters System 1 and System 2. It's a lot less descriptive, but I guess it sounds more scientific or something. Splitting up our thought processes into a fast, intuitive system and a slow, methodical one can help us understand a lot of the weird things about how people make decisions. Let's dig in a little deeper and see how each of these systems works. System 1, the robot, does the fast and automatic parts of your thinking, such as recognizing a face in a crowd, ignoring the sensation of shoes against your feet until someone points it out, driving your regular route home, answering simple questions such as what's 2 plus 2, estimating how many lemurs are chasing you, and providing the intuition, I should not let these lemurs catch me or something bad might happen. Intuitions, immediate perceptions, and gut reactions all come from System 1. Most of this happens in your subconscious, and you often take it for granted, so I'll sometimes refer to it as your internal programming. It's kind of nice having a robot behind the scenes in your mind, doing all the paperwork, but the downside is that System 1 is pretty easy to trick, so sometimes it gives wrong answers. System 2, the detective, is a part of your brain that does the slow and deliberate thinking, such as navigating a new area without a GPS, answering questions such as what's 273 plus 112, listing the pros and cons of buying a pet lemur, and thinking about your own thought processes. System 2 is much harder to trick than System 1, but it's also lazy, and often it just gives the answer passed to it by System 1 instead of thinking for itself. So, System 1 is fast and efficient, but it can be fooled pretty easily, and System 2 is slow and methodical, but it's also lazy and passes off tasks to System 1 whenever it can get away with it. This model of dividing your thinking into two parts is called dual process theory, and studying it can help us identify the areas where people tend to make mistakes in their thinking, and use that insight to make better decisions. At this point, I feel like I should mention that Kahneman doesn't actually think there are two systems in your brain structure. Talking about it this way can help you understand important aspects of how your brain works, but if you take a microscope to your brain, you won't ever find a System 1 or a System 2. It's a metaphor. It's a lie. But it's the best kind of lie, the kind that helps us organize and make sense of the world. For the rest of this episode, we're going to be focusing on System 1, the automatic system, the robot doing paperwork. That's the part of your thinking that you don't really get to see in action. It's hidden from you most of the time. I can't cover everything, and we don't know everything yet, but here are a few important concepts that'll help you understand how your System 1 likes to make decisions. Joke break. What do you ask Danny Kahneman when he has to use the bathroom? Is it a System 1 or a System 2? Part 2. Heuristics and biases. Your System 1, your robot doing paperwork, tends to use heuristics to make its work easier. Heuristics are fast and efficient rules for how to solve a problem. System 1 loves fast and efficient, and these heuristics function well most of the time, but sometimes your brain relies on them even when it doesn't make sense. A bias is a predictable pattern of error. These often happen when your System 1 uses a heuristic in a place that really deserves deliberate thinking. It can be really helpful to recognize where these biases pop up, so we're going to talk about 6 different heuristics and biases that will help you understand your internal programming a little better. These aren't the only heuristics and biases, but hopefully they'll give you a taste for what your System 1 is doing under the hood to make decisions and judgments. I'm going to associate each of the 6 heuristics and biases with an image that will hopefully make the concept more concrete and easy to remember. Hopefully it doesn't feel too cheesy. Let's go. 1. Anchoring and adjustment. Imagine a ship's anchor. It's large, it's heavy, and if you're attached to it, then it's hard for you to move very far. This anchor represents the anchoring and adjustment heuristic, which is that when making decisions or forming beliefs, we tend to start with an initial idea or anchor point and adjust from there. Let's look at an example of this. I'm going to ask you 2 questions. First, is the tallest redwood tree larger or smaller than 1,200 feet? Second, how tall do you think the tallest redwood tree is? In one experiment, people who were asked these questions gave an average answer of about 800 feet tall. But what if I had asked you instead if the tallest redwood tree is larger or smaller than 180 feet? The people asked this question guessed a much smaller average of around 300 feet, less than half of what the first group guessed. Since most people have no clue how tall the tallest tree is, they rely on any information they're given and use it as an anchor point, and then adjust from there. If given a high anchor point, they guess higher than if they'd been given a low anchor point. This is a useful heuristic most of the time, but it can mislead you when people use it against you to sell you things. Say you see a new sweater that you kind of like. The price tag says $200, but there's a deal. It's 75% off, only $50. Your brain anchors on that first number, 200, and when you compare the actual price to your anchor point, you think you're getting a bargain. But the salespeople are playing with your psychology, because if you engage your System 2, you can recognize that if the sweater had said $50 on the price tag to start with, you'd think of it as too expensive. It's still just a sweater, no matter how much the store is pretending it was worth originally. Many clothing stores, I'm specifically thinking of Kohl's and JCPenney, are notorious for this kind of price anchoring game. Anchoring may also be part of the reason so many prices end in 99. When you see a toy lemur for $7.99, it might be that your brain anchors on the 7, and you have to engage your System 2 and recognize that $7.99 is actually $8. There might also be other reasons stores do this, but anchoring is among the explanations out there. Finally, one more example. You know how sometimes stores limit how many of an item you can buy? Limit 3 packs of bottled water per customer. Surprisingly, this actually gets you to buy more than you otherwise would. For many people, when they see limit 3 per customer, they were originally only going to buy 1, but that number 3 provides a new anchor point, and so they end up walking away with 2 or 3 packs of water instead. Very tricky. So, that was anchoring. Don't let people sell you things just because they have a pretty anchor attached. Engage your System 2. Number 2, loss aversion. Picture your car keys. They're small and metallic and jingly. They're probably on a keychain with a little figurine so it's easier to recognize them. Sometimes you lose your car keys, which you really don't like because it means you have to spend 20 minutes looking all around the house for them, only to find out they were in your coat pocket the whole time. Your car keys represent loss aversion, which means that the pain of losing something, like your car keys, is much worse than the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. To illustrate loss aversion, say I offered you a bet. We'll flip a coin. If it lands on heads, I'll give you $100, but if it lands on tails, you give me $100. Would you take that bet? Most people say no way. Even if I offered you $110 or $120 if you win, the downside of losing $100 is still too much for most people. The possibility of losing so much money is felt more strongly by your System 1 than the prospect of winning is, even if taking a bet would earn you money on average. One example of loss aversion you might already be familiar with. It's called FOMO. If you're out of the loop, that stands for fear of missing out. FOMO is the anxiety that you feel when you think about how other people might be having fun without you. And this fear of missing out on the fun can motivate you to do things like spend a lot of money on an activity you don't actually like. The fear of losing out on a good experience is more motivating than the amount of happiness you expect to have, because of the FOMO is amplified by your loss aversion. Loss aversion often leads us to avoid risks. Risks mean a higher potential for embarrassment or losing money or getting hurt. Even if objectively you judge the risk to be worth it, it's still hard to convince your system one of that. But interestingly, loss aversion doesn't always make us avoid risks. Sometimes it makes us seek them out. Consider the following choice: a 100% chance to gain $450 or a 50% chance to gain $1,000. If you choose the second option, you expect to make $500 on average, but loss aversion suggests that people will prefer the safer and more certain $450. Now, what about this choice? A 100% chance to lose $450 or a 50% chance to lose $1,000? According to Kahneman, people faced with this choice tend to be risk-seeking. The certain loss of $450 feels worse than the uncertain possibility of losing a larger amount. While loss aversion usually makes us avoid risks, when we're facing a potential loss, it makes us risk-seeking. This theory helps us explain some of the behavior we see in Las Vegas. In gambling, when somebody is winning, they're less likely to take big risks. But when they've lost money, they seek out risks and sometimes bet on unlikely odds to try to regain what they lost. It's sad and it sometimes leads to people going bankrupt. Don't do that! The image I used for loss aversion was car keys. You really don't like losing your car keys. People really don't like losing money and time and social status, so much that it sometimes causes them to make irrational decisions. That's loss aversion. Number 3, availability. Think of the tip of an iceberg, only the tip. You know the rest of it must be somewhere deep below, but you can't see it. It's only the little bit floating above the water that's visible most of the time. In the same way, our brain has a whole bunch of stuff in it, but some things are more visible than others. The tip of the iceberg represents the availability heuristic, which is that we judge things as more likely or more important when examples of it are more visible, when it's easy to pull examples from our memory because they're recent or vivid or have been repeated to us frequently. Here's an example. If something is overrepresented in the news, then people tend to believe it's more common than it actually is. Consider some really dramatic events, such as shark attacks, plane crashes, and terrorism. These are all extremely rare events, but they always make the news, and they have vivid imagery that makes them easy to remember, so information about them will be very available to your System 1. When you have to make a judgment about the probability of something happening, many examples that you think of will be from things you read in the news. The probability of dying from a car crash? People tend to think it's much lower than it actually is, because car crash deaths don't usually make the news unless it's someone famous. The probability of dying in a shark attack? People dramatically overestimate it, because every single shark attack gets in the news, even if it's on the other side of the world, so the average person's System 1 has plenty of stories to draw from. I just looked it up, and on average, only half a person dies from a shark attack every year. The availability heuristic is also well known to advertisers. Even if you think the constant ads are annoying, they keep the product at the top of your mind. So the next time you need that kind of thing, for example a VPN or a chicken sandwich, the first one you think of will likely be the one you've heard advertised most often, or most recently. NordVPN and ExpressVPN are the ones I've heard advertised about 12 times a day on YouTube. Then, if you're a good, responsible adult, you'll do research to figure out if they're actually good or not. But here's the kicker. If you're a lazy researcher, or if you research it and every brand seems equally good, you might default to the one that sounds most familiar, the one that's most available to your System 1, the one that was advertised to you the most. Got 'em. Here's another example. Consider the following question. Assuming you live with at least one other person, who takes out the trash most often in your house? People tend to overestimate their contribution to household chores. When you think about who takes out the trash more, all the times you did it will come to mind. Those times are more vivid because you actually experienced them. Also, you might not be aware of all the times other people took out the trash without you realizing it. The availability heuristic can fool you into thinking you're doing more than your share, even if an objective analysis would show that the chores are being divided up equally. So, please give your housemates the benefit of the doubt. They're probably doing much more than you realize. I used the tip of an iceberg to represent the availability heuristic. The tip is very available, but you have to keep reminding yourself that the tip isn't the only part of an iceberg. The availability heuristic means that you'll often judge things that are less vivid or recent or repeated less frequently to be less common and important than they actually are. These are like the part of the iceberg hiding underwater, and like an iceberg, they'll cause problems if you ignore them. Number 4. Attribute substitution. Next, think of your substitute teacher. Whenever your 4th grade teacher got sick, this substitute would show up to replace her. The substitute wasn't quite as good at teaching as your normal teacher, but most of the time she was good enough that it worked anyway. Your substitute teacher represents attribute substitution. When your System 1 sees a hard problem it doesn't know how to solve, it replaces it with an easier problem it can solve. Which is great, it gets you an answer, but it can also mislead you sometimes. For example, consider the following problem. A bat and a ball together cost $1.10. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Feel free to pause if you want to figure it out for yourself. But if not, I'm moving on. If you let your System 1 answer the bat and ball question, then it probably fed you the answer 10 cents. But that's wrong. The ball costs 5 cents. That's $1 less than the bat, which costs $1.05. 5 cents plus $1.05 makes $1.10. Your System 1 failed you. How could this happen? Your inner robot is good at doing paperwork, but it is not good at complex math. The bat and the ball problem requires a little bit of algebra level reasoning, and so System 1 tends to substitute an easier question and split the sum into $1 for the bat and 10 cents for the ball, which is close enough for most purposes. Normally, your System 2 would catch the error, but this problem seems easy enough that for many people who've never seen it before, it doesn't raise their mental alarms to rouse your lazy System 2 into action and correct the mistake. You never even realized the substitution occurred. Another consequence of attribute substitution is the halo effect. When somebody has a prominent positive trait, it influences our judgments of them in other, completely unrelated areas. For example, if someone is good looking, people are more likely to judge them as intelligent. If someone has a nice voice, people are more likely to think of them as physically attractive, even if they've never seen him before. If someone smiles a lot, people are more likely to judge them as kind and altruistic. Even though, in reality, these attributes are all independent of each other, your inner robot doesn't care. It's programmed to be fast and efficient. And it's really fast and efficient to use attribute substitution to fill in the gaps in your knowledge. The halo effect is when you fill in those gaps with positive attributes, like judging a politician as more agreeable because they're physically attractive. System 1 doesn't know the answer to the question, who should I vote for? But it can answer the question, who do I like more? And sometimes that substitution happens without you ever realizing it. The halo effect also has a counterpart called the horn effect. A single negative trait can influence your perception of somebody's entire character. If you meet someone who chews with their mouth open, then, barring further information about them, you're likely to judge them as less intelligent, less kind, less physically attractive, and more likely to disagree with you on politics. The halo and horn effects are about anchoring on the first piece of information you learn, and then substituting it in when you have to make other judgments about the person. Or, if there's some aspect of the person that's particularly prominent, then it gets substituted in because it's more available to your System 1. So anchoring and availability both contribute to what attribute gets substituted in. I used a substitute teacher to represent attribute substitution. The substitute usually does the job, but it's never quite as good as the real deal. But, unlike a substitute teacher, attribute substitution happens without you ever realizing it. It's like if your substitute teacher put on a costume to make her look like your normal teacher, and you can only tell that she's a substitute if you pay close attention. Sneaky, sneaky. Number 5. Representativeness. Next, Leonardo da Vinci. What's he doing? He's making a prototype of his new invention. It might be a flying machine, or a giant crossbow, or an underwater diving suit. He's going to make a different version later, but this one is the prototype, the very first of its kind, and all future models will be compared to this one. Da Vinci represents the representativeness heuristic, which says that our brain classifies things based on how closely they represent a prototype we have of that thing in our brain. The prototypes in your brain are slightly different from Da Vinci's. Da Vinci's prototype is the first example of that type of thing. Your brain's prototypes aren't necessarily the first examples you see, but the most typical generalizations. A chicken has 2 legs and clucks. A cat has 4 legs and meows. A dog has 4 legs and flees. Okay, actually the dog one was a stereotype. A stereotype is an oversimplified generalization. If most of the dogs you've seen have been strays, then you might generalize that all dogs have fleas, but this stereotype isn't actually true. A stereotype is a prototype that's inaccurate in a way that can be harmful. Your System 1 classifies things based on how much they represent your prototype or stereotype of that thing. What do I mean by that? Think of a generic fantasy novel. How thick is it? Is it hardcover or softcover? Or is it an ebook or audiobook? What does the cover look like? Are there elves or dwarves, or swords or magic? Your answers to those questions can help you understand what your prototype of a fantasy novel looks like. In my mind, a good fantasy novel is a hardcover with bright colors on the artwork, the title in large letters, and at least some of the words magic, dragon, quest, and adventure on the blurb. If I want to tell at a glance if I'll like the book, I judge it based on how closely it matches my prototype of a fantasy novel, which means that the representativeness heuristic is, at its core, judging books by their covers. The representativeness heuristic goes hand in hand with attribute substitution. When your System 1 encounters a hard question, it substitutes in the easier question of how closely that thing is related to your prototype of it. Is this a good fantasy novel? Your inner robot doesn't know, but it does know how closely it matches your prototype of a fantasy novel. If it matches closely, then it's probably a good one, says your System 1. With this in mind, consider the following problem that illustrates the representativeness heuristic. It's about a woman named Linda. Linda is 31 years old, single, outspoken, and very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable? Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement? People tend to choose option 2. While trying to answer this question, you compare Linda to a prototype that you have of her in your brain of what a bank teller should look like, and a prototype of what a feminist should look like. And since she matched the feminist prototype better, you choose option 2. The problem with this is that if Linda is a feminist bank teller, then she's also a bank teller. This means that, by the rules of probability, there is no way for option 2 to be more likely than option 1. You mistook plausibility for probability. It sounds plausible that Linda is a feminist bank teller, but in reality it's more likely that she's a bank teller of any sort, feminist or otherwise. That's an example of how representativeness can fool you. I used Leonardo da Vinci to making a prototype to represent how your brain compares things to a prototype or stereotype when making judgments, which is called the representativeness heuristic. The problem is that this can sometimes cause us to make judgments based on incorrect stereotypes. It takes real effort to employ System 2 and deliberately set those stereotypes to the side when we need to. Number 6. Confirmation bias. The last item on our list is a water filter. You run water through it and it separates out any dirt and gunk and microplastic that's floating in it. You only drink the water that gets through. Whatever doesn't get through the filter gets thrown away. The filter represents confirmation bias, the tendency for people to favor information that agrees with their pre-existing beliefs, and ignore or throw away information that they don't agree with. It's like the information you receive goes through a filter. This makes it very hard to dislodge a belief once it gets formed. When I use the word bias here, I'm using it to mean a systematic error. If your friend plays a prank on you and repaints all the numbers on your ruler so that they're one number larger, then your ruler will give measurements that are biased to be 1 inch larger than they should be. That's the image my brain pulls up when I hear the word bias, an inaccurate ruler that makes your measurements consistently wrong in one direction. Confirmation bias makes you consistently judge information to agree with what you already believe. For example, if a detective identifies a suspect early in the investigation, then they'll tend to focus on evidence that confirms that the person is guilty and not look as hard for evidence that the person's innocent. If a doctor decides early on that you probably have X disease, they might anchor on that idea and focus on evidence that supports their conclusion. In sports and politics, horoscopes, and even scientific research, people tend to focus on information that favors their side. Confirmation bias comes in 3 flavors: a biased search for information, a biased interpretation of information, and a biased memory of information. I'm going to give examples of each. First, the biased search for information. I see this happening to me whenever I Google something about politics or world events. Maybe you've seen it too. I tend to spend more time on the ones I agree with and skip over the ones that I know I won't agree with. It makes life more pleasant to focus on information I already agree with, but it's a terrible way to find the most accurate information. Another example, one that resonates with me a lot. This one was created by a psychologist named Peter Wasson. He was actually the one who coined the phrase confirmation bias. Wasson has a famous experiment called the 2-4-6 task, which illustrates some important aspects of how people tend to search for information. It goes like this. I'm thinking of a rule that applies to sets of 3 numbers. One set that follows this rule is 2, 4, 6. You're trying to figure out the rule by guessing sets of 3 numbers. I'm going to give you a sample dialogue that shows what this task tends to look like. You can check the show notes if you want to know where I pulled it from. Are you ready? Here's what the guesses tend to look like. 4, 6, 8. Yes, that follows the rule. 10, 12, 14? Yes. It can't be that easy. 1, 3, 5. Yes. -3, -1, +1? Yes. The rule is that the numbers have to increase by 2 each time. Is that your final answer? This test is harder than it looks. But what did I miss? Maybe 2, 5, 8? Yes. 10, 20, 30? Yes. The real answer is that the numbers have to go up by the same amount each time. It doesn't have to be 2. That's my final answer. How about you, the listener? Are you satisfied with that answer? What other sets of numbers would you want to guess? If you want to pause to think about it, do it now, because I'll reveal the answer in 3, 2, 1. The real rule was any 3 numbers in increasing order, lowest to highest. Are you surprised? This dialogue was a perfect example of a biased search for information. The guesser thought they knew the pattern almost immediately, thinking it was numbers increasing by 2 each time, so they only guessed sequences that fit that pattern. When challenged, they modified the rule slightly to be numbers increasing by the same amount each time. But let me point out something about the guesses that's also true of most people who take this test. Not a single set of numbers that was guessed broke the rule. For all they knew, the rule could have been all sets of 3 numbers, and the conversation would have been identical. a perfect example of confirmation bias steering the search for information. Let's move on to the biased interpretation of information. I'm going to illustrate this with an example. Acai berries are the berries of a palm tree native to Brazil. Some people believe that acai berries are a superfood that will solve all your health problems. Other people don't hold this belief. Now, pretend you just read a news article about a new study that says acai berries are proven to have high concentrations of antioxidants, which have been shown to have positive health benefits, and this study found a positive but not statistically significant effect on heart health. If you believe acai berries are a superfood, you may interpret this study as supporting your belief. If you don't believe acai berries are a superfood, then you might focus on how the results were not statistically significant and think that this study supports your belief that there's no good evidence in favor of the berries. Another example is what Malcolm Gladwell calls the satire paradox. Satire, like what you see in The Onion, Saturday Night Live, and South Park, is usually meant to criticize people or social trends. But sometimes this criticism can backfire, and the audience takes it as an endorsement of the thing it's trying to make fun of. For example, there's a show called The Colbert Report, where the guy portrays a conservative commentator and gives the news with an ironic exaggeration. According to a survey, people with liberal views who watch it tend to think the show is criticizing conservative viewpoints, while people with conservative views who watch it tend to think Colbert is only pretending to be joking and actually believes the things he says on the show. This is great for the TV ratings, because it means he gets views from both sides of the political spectrum, but it also demonstrates clearly how confirmation bias influences the way we interpret information. Let's go on to the biased memory of information, or selective memory. There are plenty of examples of this, but I like the one that has to do with extrasensory perception, or ESP, where some people believe lets you sense things using your mind. Researchers took some people who believe in ESP and some who don't, and showed them descriptions of ESP experiments. Half of each group was told the results of the experiments supported the existence of ESP, and the other half were told the experiments did not support it. Later, most people accurately remembered what they were told, but believers of ESP who were told that the evidence didn't support their belief remembered much less of the information, and some of them incorrectly remembered being told that the results supported ESP. We remember information better if it confirms our existing beliefs. Which isn't to say that confirmation bias isn't useful. It certainly boosts your confidence to only see information you agree with, and confidence is very important in social settings. And, in a group setting, if you missed something important, someone else is likely to point it out, so confirmation bias does less harm than you'd expect in group decision-making. But, when it comes to individual beliefs and decision-making, confirmation bias can be a big problem. I used the image of a water filter to illustrate confirmation bias. Confirmation bias serves as a filter in what information we're exposed to, in how we interpret that information, and in how much of that information we remember. 3 filters. That's a lot of filter. At least knowing confirmation bias exists can help you watch out for it and try to make corrections whenever you notice it pop its head up. Bad confirmation bias. Get off the couch. Part 3. Conclusion. We started out by talking about the robot and the detective in your brain. The detective is the part of you that does deliberate thinking and reasoning, but it's lazy and loves to pass off tasks to the other guy. The robot is the programming in your subconscious mind that integrates information and produces intuitions. It works constantly, but sometimes makes mistakes. We then focused on some of the ways the robot-like System 1 works, so that you can recognize when it's likely to make a mistake. I used imagery to help make these ideas more concrete. Now let's combine all the images together. Leonardo da Vinci and your substitute teacher are on a boat with a very large anchor. They're holding your car keys and trying to make them pass through a funnel. They're so busy doing that they don't even notice that the ship is about to hit the tip of an iceberg. Are you visualizing that? Good. Then hopefully you can remember the 6 different heuristics and biases we talked about today. The anchor represents the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. We tend to grab onto the first piece of information we find and adjust from there, which helps our System 1 be more efficient. Car keys represent loss aversion. To our brain, a loss is about twice as powerful as a gain, which is a fast and efficient way to keep us from getting hurt. The tip of an iceberg represents the availability heuristic. Information that's more visible to your brain seems more important. This is another shortcut your System 1 uses to be more efficient. Your substitute teacher represents attribute substitution. System 1 doesn't solve hard problems, but substitutes in something easier it can solve, which lets it be fast and, you guessed it, efficient. Leonardo da Vinci represents the representativeness heuristic. We make automatic judgments based on how closely things resemble our prototypes of them, which, again, lets our System 1 be fast and efficient. And finally, a filter represents confirmation bias. We filter out information that contradicts our existing beliefs. I don't actually know the purpose of confirmation bias, but if I were to render a guess, I would say that maybe it has something to do with speed and efficiency. System 1 is truly remarkable in how well it works, and knowing about its different failure modes can be a big help for making better decisions and more accurate judgments. And if you like big fat books about cognitive psychology, the book Thinking Fast and Slow has all sorts of other ideas that help me see intuition and reasoning in a new light, and I highly recommend it. Here's a joke to end with. A high school senior visits a psychic and asks which colleges will accept him. The psychic says, "I don't know, but I can tell you that it will cost an absurd amount of money." "How do you know this?" the student asks. The psychic replies, "It's mostly intuition." Well, that's the end. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ideas Worth Exploring. And come back next time for more science. Peace. This has been Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark McDonald.